Well, after that kind of an introduction, I'm not quite sure whether I can live up to it, but I will do my best. First of all, thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me here. It's been a long time since I've been in Philadelphia, but we were reminiscing that the last time I actually spoke here, I was speaking about the war crimes issue. So in a sense, all those many years later, we're still talking about the same thing. Why? And I think this is the message that I want to resonate most with you, is why are we still talking about Nazi war criminals in the United States or in Canada so many years later after the Demineux case in the United States, after the various commissions of inquiry that were held in Canada, after the OSI came and went? And the simple answer is because it is still part of the Russian disinformation campaign directed against Ukraine and Ukrainians. When Vladimir Putin, the KGB man in the Kremlin, announced the reasons for his so-called special military operation, he actually said, we're going into Ukraine to get rid of the banderivchi. He actually didn't say Nazis at first. Now, since then, he said Nazis, nationalists, extremists, and so on, because the Western world generally doesn't know who Bandera was. We do, but they don't. Our neighbors don't. So, from the beginning, Vladimir Putin, a man who's my age, whose grandfather was in the Cheka and was a servant of Stalin, whose father was in the NKVD and served Stalin, and Vladimir Putin himself, who was in the KGB, so 3 generations of Soviet secret policemen. He's a classic Soviet man who believes that he has sent his forces in to Ukraine to get rid of the Ukrainian nationalists, the banderivchi, and of course he calls them Nazis. This is a typical Soviet-era description of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, and it resonates with Mr. Putin and his followers to this day. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is how does all this fit into what's happening or has happened since the escalation of the war against Ukraine that began on the 24th of February this year. And of course, Ukraine has never had the kind of support or interest that we see today in the United States or in Canada or anywhere else in the world for that matter. We have a unique opportunity here to begin to leach some of that Soviet poison that the Russian Federation still propagates out of the system. Because I think all Americans and Canadians, when they hear Putin talking about the government of Ukraine being Nazi, say, well, excuse me, isn't Mr. Zelensky Jewish? So they laugh, just like you're laughing. And yet, just a few weeks ago, the largest circulating Canadian newspaper, the Toronto Star, ran an editorial about how there were Nazis in Canada that hadn't been brought to justice. So I'm going to address all of this. We've had incidents of vandalism against monuments. We don't know what happened in some of these places, but clearly monuments to the Divizia Halichina have been destroyed or vandalized. Monuments to Shukhevich have been vandalized. There is an active campaign encouraging people to actually go out to community centers like this one and deface them. Just in the hallway here, you have a memorial to the veterans of the Ukrainian Divizia Halichina. This is a target for some people. So let's talk about all of that and why it's important to you, to me. I'm a Canadian Ukrainian, you're American Ukrainians. It's even more important, frankly, for your children and your grandchildren, because this poison that was spread in the system, Operation Payback as it was known, continues to this day. I'm going to start with a quotation from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. You've heard of him. And it's not clear whether he actually wrote this, but probably. So here's what he said. We know they are lying. They know that we know they are lying. They know we know they are lying. We know they know we know they are lying. But yet, they're still lying. And this is the point. You just keep repeating these lies, and although intelligent people everywhere go, that's not true, that's a lie, but if you keep repeating it and repeating it and repeating it, even though you and I might know the truth is very different, it seeps in. So how did I get caught up in all of this? Well, I can tell you with some precision, because one of the things I've done since I went to graduate school a very long time ago was I've kept a daily diary. And I still keep it. I was writing it this morning in New York. So there are 133 volumes, I think, now. And I'm starting to, I talk long and I write too much. If they ever get a hold of those diaries, I'm in deep, deep trouble. The beauty of it now, though, is I'm actually going back to it as I'm getting close to retirement, and I'm going through and pulling things from the diaries that relate to Ukrainian, Canadian, and Ukrainian history. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. People I met, characters I worked with, events I came to, people I would like to remember, and some I'd like to forget. It's all there, and it's fun to go through. So I remember when I was first brought on board in respect to this whole argument about are there Nazis in Canada or the United States. The date was exactly April the 8th, 1985. I had just finished my PhD at the University of Alberta. I'd returned to the University of Toronto on a postdoctoral fellowship, and I was invited by the community to join something that was in those days known as the Civil Liberties Commission and became the Ukrainian-Canadian Civil Liberties Association. It was a group that was cobbled together by the community to defend ourselves against the allegations that within the Ukrainian-Canadian community there were thousands of Nazi war criminals being hidden. And you were getting the same thing in the United States. So we created this group. It was headed by a mildly eccentric lawyer by the name of John Gregorovich, who's since passed. He was very committed to the cause of Ukraine's independence and very determined as a Canadian-Ukrainian of several generations to stand up against what he believed was actually Soviet disinformation. So JB, as we called him, deciphered, if you like, a Soviet design behind the stories that began circulating about thousands of Nazi war criminals hiding allegedly throughout North America. This campaign began, this rumor mongering began in the United States. We don't know precisely when. We've only begun to find some of the KGB documents that prove this beyond a shadow of a doubt. Somewhere in the late 1970s, the KGB deliberately began seeding stories, planting stories in major American newspapers, media outlets, and putting books into libraries and circulating leaflets. Some of you will remember them. There were things like We Accuse and the Truth About UPA, all this kind of stuff. They were circulating booklets, leaflets, films, and spreading the word that after the Second World War, thousands of Nazi war criminals, collaborators, fascists, Ukrainians, and so on, who worked with the Nazis during the Holocaust, murdering Jews, Poles, and others, had escaped justice and were hiding in the United States or Canada. When this blew up in Canada, it was already the mid-1980s. And it caused such public outrage that there might be a Nazi living next door. In the American case, it was a guy called Alan Ryan, wrote a book called Quiet Neighbor. Right? Oh, why is that person with a funny accent doesn't talk about what he did in the war? You know, who is he? So in Canada, this precipitated the creation of an official or a royal commission. We're still a very British kind of society, so we had a royal commission. It was called the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals. It was headed by Mr. Justice Jules Deschênes. And he spent the following 2 years investigating the wartime record of the Divizia Halachna, because that was an SS division, so that must have been Nazis, right? Of OUN, UPA, whether Milnikevich, Banderevich, or any other kind of Evich, they were investigating all of them for almost 2.5 years. And this was very controversial. Understandably, and I want to be very clear that you'll hear me on this, understandably, Jewish Canadians said, what? Nazis came to Canada and are hiding here in Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, wherever? We have to get these people to justice. I lost parents or friends or grandparents in the Holocaust. These people shouldn't be here. That's perfectly comprehensible. If I'd been Jewish, I would have said the same thing. We agreed with them, but we said, here's our basic principle that we want to see followed. Any war criminal found in North America should be brought to justice. Anyone. So regardless of who you were, where you were, what your ethnicity was, what your faith group was, your age, your sex, whatever, your political ideology, if you are a person who committed crimes against humanity or war crimes, you should be brought to justice in a criminal court of law where the rules of evidence are very stringent. That was our position then. It's remained our position to this day. Eventually, and frankly not surprisingly, Mr. Justice Deschênes' public report, which came out in 1987, absolutely excoriated the people who had advocated for the story that there were thousands of Nazi war criminals in Canada. He actually scolded them publicly. So Mr. Justice Deschênes said that the numbers of hundreds or thousands of Nazis in Canada were grossly exaggerated. Those are exactly his words. By no less than a factor of over 400%. So in other words, the people going, yak, 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 there are Nazis amongst us, let's say I don't know that they were making it up, but it was certainly grossly exaggerated. Now, unfortunately, Justice Deschênes died in the year 2000, so he never learned what we now know, or what JB had hinted at, and that is that the KGB deliberately fabricated this controversy. The document is called Operation Payback, or you can translate it as Operation Retribution. It's actually republished in the book, so you can see it yourself in the original Ukrainian version and in English translation. So it is very clearly proof, chorny na biele, as we say in Ukrainian, black and white, that the KGB tried to provoke tension between Jews and Ukrainians and Balts in the diasporas in order to undermine any united front that might have been created. Now think back to the 60s and 70s. Jewish refuseniks, Ukrainian dissidents, remember all of them? Yeah. You know, the cultural renaissance, people were trying to sort of articulate a Ukrainian identity and they were being suppressed. They weren't being murdered in their millions, but they were being sent to psychiatric institutions, they were being sent to the Gulag and so on. Jews and Ukrainians began working together inside the Soviet Union. And they were getting support from the Jewish diaspora, particularly in the United States, and in Canada, and around the Western free world. And Ukrainians and Jews were starting to talk, despite some long-lasting, lingering stereotypes and prejudices, and I don't have to go into that, we all know what those are. But despite all that, on their side and ours, we were starting to work together, and the KGB didn't like that. So how do you break it up? Some genius said, let's play the Nazi card. Let's say these Ukrainians were collaborators, fascists, supporters of the Holocaust, who murdered Jews. Let's stir that up. Let's remind them of the pogroms of World War I and Petlura, all that stuff. Churn it all up and turn Jews and Ukrainians against each other. And our Baltic friends too. I mean, they were involved in this, but they were smaller communities. Now, we have the document, and you can see it for yourself. And I think if there's no other contribution this book makes, it puts that document on the record. And you might say, well, why wouldn't you just put it on the internet? Because I know I've heard this several times. People say, why do a book about this? Because, ladies and gentlemen, as Udana very kindly mentioned, I've written many articles about this whole issue over the years, over some 40 years since I first got involved, 41 years now. And I can tell you that articles I wrote in major Canadian newspapers are now hidden behind firewalls, and if you're not prepared to pay, and if you don't know the date, and you don't know the title, you might not find them. I can't find some of my own articles. It's a good thing I kept them, you know, in a papka, in a filing drawer, because I'm still old-fashioned. I don't even carry a cell phone. As Udana is still yelling at me. She'll be taking up a collection later. So I still believe that the important way of preserving knowledge and the truth is to get books on shelves. And I mean this. So when you buy books, you're actually supporting other books being sent free of charge to libraries around the world. Operation Payback was even sent to the Russian National Library with my compliments. And you know what? I have to admit, they often send a thank you note. So, and the nice thing about that is they've always been very kind that way, I have to say. But when I was recently put on the banned list as a persona non grata in the Russian Federation, which pains me deeply because I really wanted to get back to see Lenin one last time. They spelled my name wrong, so I had to write to the foreign minister of Russia saying, guys, if you're going to ban me, could you at least get my name right? They haven't replied yet, but I'm sure they will. Anyway. So books are important. Now, in the book, as you'll see, I even know when I first heard a warning from a Ukrainian dissident that this is what Moscow was up to. It was the 6th of March, 1981, and I was in Toronto, and I had attended a talk by someone that some of you will certainly remember, Valentin Moroz. Okay? He was then a very well-known and highly, at that time, respected dissident. And after the event was over, I wrote in my diary that Moroz had warned us in the diaspora that Moscow was attempting to paralyze, that was his exact word, the Ukrainian community of the United States and Canada by spreading pernicious rumors about what happened on Ukrainian soil during the Second World War. The Soviets, Moroz insisted, were hoping to pit the Jewish and Ukrainian communities against each other. We didn't listen. We actually, we heard it, but we didn't listen. Again, about a year later, when I'd gotten out to the University of Alberta, I was approached by Dr. Manoli Lupul, who was the director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the time. He knew I'd interviewed hundreds of so-called DPs, displaced persons, and had talked to them about their wartime experiences. And he said, off the record, Любомир, did you find any Nazis? Right? So, even in our own academic world, this sort of fear, this concern, this angst was spreading. And I told him, no, I said, I haven't. In fact, I think the story is a false story. I said, I'd interviewed literally hundreds of people, and I thought that there were very, very few, if any, who had committed war crimes that might have gotten to Canada or the United States, and that all of the current concern and debate about it in 1985, the Deschênes Commission was still active, was a political football, period. Now, I haven't changed my opinion. I've remained a member of the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association for over 40 years. It sometimes, as was hinted, has cost me dearly. I won't lie to you. Taking a position on some of these issues, whether it's taking the government of Canada to task for what happened during the First World War, or arguing against the way in which they have dealt with the Ukrainian community on all sorts of issues, has had its costs. But I have no regrets, really. I've fought the good fight, and I think I've fought it on the right side, so be it. But there are a few things I do want to tell you that I think you need to be able to articulate to your neighbors and friends and children and grandchildren, particularly around this issue of Nazis in the United States or Nazis in Canada. First of all, we have to confirm what I will call an existential reality. So pay real careful attention to this, because this is like a key point. There are no Nazis left. None. It's over. Okay? Now, how do I know that? How can I make such a bold statement? Well, do the math. Take the case of an 18-year-old German who joined, in 1932, joined the Nazi Party. That's when Hitler came to power in 1933. So take this imaginary Fritz, and if you do the math, today he'd be 106. So he'd be dead. Okay? So he's gone. Even if you take an 18-year-old who joined the SS in 1939 at the start of the Second World War, he'd now be 100. Now, there could be a few, and in fact, recently, since I wrote the book, I've heard that there's one 100-year-old German camp guard that they found somewhere who's essentially blind and completely, basically, without any chance of defending himself, who's been brought before a German tribunal. They don't tell you much about it. Who knows? But the bottom line is they're dead. They're dead. Okay? Most people don't live to be 100. My father lived to be 101, died shoveling snow. I told him, Tata, don't shovel snow. He didn't listen. He joined my mom. There are thankfully no Chekists left. There are no people of Putin's father's vintage, the Putins who dutifully served Stalin. But there could still be some Russian or Soviet war criminals around. Why? Well, again, let's do some math. Take an 18-year-old Russian, Ivan, joined the OKPU, the Soviet secret police, in 1929. That's when the first 5-year plan began, collectivization, leading up to, of course, the Holodomor, the genocidal Great Famine of 32-33. If our make-believe Ivan survived all that and then survived the Great Patriotic War, he would today be about 110, so dead as well. If, on the other hand, he had joined as an 18-year-old in 1944, perhaps participating in the genocidal deportation of Crimean Tatars from Ukraine, then perhaps he would have used that experience with counterinsurgency to fight the nationalists in the Baltic states or in Ukraine. And today, such a person could still be alive in 95. So there's a few, for sure. And of course, we must keep in mind that the Soviet Union did not collapse until 1991, right? So the Soviet Union continued to repress people, to indulge in crimes against humanity, war crimes, until 1991. So there are certainly people alive who were in the KGB, including the man in the Kremlin today, who participated in atrocities. Now, what's it matter to us if they're sitting in the Russian Federation, or even in Ukraine for that matter? Well, the answer is very simple. Some of them came to North America. Some of them came here after 1991, claiming to be refugees, claiming to be people who left the Soviet Union because it collapsed and they wanted to have a better life. How much vetting, how much screening was there of those people? I don't know the answer to that in the United States because I'm not a scholar of the American immigration experience, but I can tell you that in Canada, we identified 5, not 500, not 5,000, I'm not interested in exaggerating. We found 5 people who had been veterans of SMERSH, the NKVD, or KGB, who were in Canada, and several of those men, there was also one woman, by the way, I'll tell you about her in a moment, they're all described in the book in some detail, wrote their own books in English, published in Canada, in which they bragged about how they murdered Ukrainian nationalists, how they served in the NKVD. One of them even generously produced a photograph of himself in his NKVD lieutenant's uniform. And I've reproduced it in the book because, you know, he wants to have his picture in the book. So people who openly said, I was in the NKVD, I was in the KGB, I killed people. Oh, when I came to Canada, I didn't tell them that, of course. I said I was just a chauffeur. So these were people who lied to Canadian immigration officials and yet managed to get into Canada. One, the woman who was living in Montreal, was in SMERSH. She was a young woman when she became a medical doctor in Kyiv just before the war broke out. She then served with a unit that executed political prisoners, deserters, dissidents, nationals, and so on. And her job as a doctor, as a physician, was to get in the grave after the shooting was done and make sure everyone was dead. Not to patch them up, not to rescue them, but to say, hey guys, you missed one. Is this the physician's oath? Is this what you're supposed to do when you're a physician? I don't think so. And she openly told this story to the Montreal Gazette, and everyone thought, oh, isn't that wonderful? We got her removed from Canada, or at least we got her so scared that I think she left. Although I can't be sure. We had an NKVD translator, supposedly, who came and tried to get into Canada, got into Canada, went to school, was doing his PhD in Japanese linguistics, left for some reason to go visit someone in the United States. When he returned from his holiday, a Canadian immigration official said, wait a minute, who are you? And figured out that he'd been in the KGB, said, you don't have the right to come in Canada. This man was smart enough to say, I'm claiming refugee status. So immediately he goes into the refugee stream. He was then heard before the Immigration and Refugee Board. I used to be part of that board, not in his case, but I was a member. He was found not to be a refugee and told, leave. What did he do? He didn't leave. If any of you have seen The Hunchback of Notre Dame, you know, the movie, the old movie, or the Disney cartoon, you know how she runs into the cathedral and claims sanctuary? There's no such legal principle in American or Canadian law. There's no such thing as sanctuary. It's a cartoon. He ran into an East Vancouver church and claimed sanctuary. And our government was so woke, they wouldn't go in and get, oh, we can't go into a church. I said, well, I'd go in with a couple of my buddies and pull them out for you. Somehow they didn't take me up on my offer. I thought I was a little too aggressive, I guess. So we had him in there for almost 2.5 years. And we would send postcards. You'll see some examples of the postcards we use, because in Canada we have this wonderful thing called franking. You can write to your member of parliament or to the prime minister for free. So we print thousands of postcards, and we send thousands of postcards on whatever subject we want. It doesn't cost us any postage. It's just, it's an irritation. It's kind of a, Chinese water torture, drip, drip, drip. So we would send the latitude and the longitude of the church, to the RCMP saying, here's where he is, right here. Take a picture of the church. He's downstairs. We kept doing this until eventually he snuck out and left. But the simple point is, here was a man who had no right to be in Canada, who was heard by a competent board, was told, no, you have to leave, sir, and then he played that trick. There's a big difference between how these people were treated and how Ukrainians and others were treated. Now, again, let's back up a bit. We all know Jewish Americans, Jewish Canadians whose grandparents perhaps suffered great loss during the Holocaust. Those people have the satisfaction of knowing that the major villains, those who survived the war, were brought to justice at Nuremberg, tried, and punished. And the lesser villains, those who got away with it, and some obviously did, spent the rest of their lives scurrying about and hiding, right? Nobody today says what the Nazis did was good. Nobody justifies their deeds. Nobody justifies their ideology, except perhaps a few nut jobs. So the satisfaction you can at least take on that side is, well, the bad guys got what they deserved, and the world condemns Nazism. Regrettably, no similar effort was ever made to punish Stalin's henchmen, nor those in the Soviet Union who committed crimes against humanity, Vinnytsia, Katyn, Bikivnia, for example, or the Holodomor. Right? No one was ever brought to justice. Most Soviet mass murderers and their assorted apologists instead were pensioned off and lived lives of comparative comfort. So we've all heard of Kaganovich, for example, Stalin's satrap in Soviet Ukraine during the Holodomor. He died peacefully in Moscow on the 25th of July, 1991. You've all heard of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the deal between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin to carve up Eastern Europe to begin what becomes the Second World War. Molotov, to the last day of his life, was an unrepentant Stalinist, and he died 96 years old in Moscow in 1986. Even the original head of the Gulag, a guy called Matvei Berman, was never brought to justice. He lived, I'm just looking for the year, he lived out most of his life, was eventually shot by Stalin, but was never actually then punished beyond that. He was rehabilitated later by Khrushchev. So when we consider this history, what we realize is that some of the bad guys got away with it. Some of them really did. Even Stalin, who I think we all recognize him, please no one say anything with a mustache. He died in '53 and I came back with a mustache, and I tell my students that all the time. Even Stalin is honorably buried in the wall of the Kremlin to this day. The last time, probably the only time I'll ever get back to the Russian Federation, when I went to see Lenin's tomb and went behind Lenin's tomb, Stalin is there. All the other greats of Soviet history are honored daily with red carnations. Stalin gets red roses. It's a bit of a difference there. So these people, Stalin, Lenin, embalmed and put into shrines for, like uncorrupted saints, have been made into sort of objects of modern day cult worship. And in fact, Putin certainly does worship the Stalinist, Leninist legacy. How does this all relate to the question, though, of war criminals in Canada and the United States? Well, quite predictably, and I've already given you a few hints about this, old men start dying off eventually. So the old women, we all die. So recognizing that that was happening in Canada, the Canadian government, which had never been able to make a single case of he's a war criminal, prove it in a Canadian Criminal Court of Justice stick, since they couldn't prove it, they looked to the American experience and said, well, look, the Americans don't do it the way we do. They don't use criminal courts. The American OSI, Office of Special Investigations, I see some heads nodding, you all remember them, and remind me to tell you about Ukrainian war crime investigations now. The Canadians said, the OSI doesn't bother with criminal justice, where you have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that someone's guilty. Remember, the fundamental principle, I think we all agree, is you're innocent until proven guilty. Well, that doesn't work, because it's so hard to prove these people guilty. So what do? Okay, we'll say that when he came to the United States, he was asked, because we asked everyone, whether he'd served in the Ukrainian SS division or in OUN or in UPA or was a camp guard, whatever he may have done. And we asked everyone absolutely for sure. And if he's here, he obviously lied. So we will denaturalize him, we will take away his citizenship, and we will deport him. So in Canada, we were going to find Nazis and put them in jail in Canada, punish them in Canada. The American model was, if we think you may have been a Nazi, and after all, you're here, and you now tell us you were in OUN or in Divizia or UPA, you must have lied back in 46, 47, 48, 49, so we'll just deport you. And they did that with Demjanjuk, we all remember. They did that with many others. Some people managed to negotiate settlements. Some people have quietly moved to Costa Rica or what have you. But your community and ours was subjected to a great period of stress and threat. Canada said, hey, the OSI D&D method works. We'll adopt it. So we actually learned from OSI and brought D&D to Canada. Wow. That certainly caused great grief. I don't think I need to explain to this community how many families were financially ruined, how our communities had to rally in defense of the good name of Ukrainians, of OUN, UPA, Divizia, and so on. This should be fairly evident to most of you. Intriguingly, however, this D&D procedure was only ever applied to so-called Nazis. Again, no KGB man in the United States, or in Canada, or SMERSH, or NKVD was ever subjected to the same treatment. It was directed primarily against Baltic Americans, Baltic Canadians, Ukrainian Americans. No other villains were ever subjected to this. And these were very well-funded organizations, the OSI and the Deschênes Commission, and then the Ministry of Justice's War Crimes Unit in Canada. In Canada, D&D failed. Why? Well, because the evidence was simply not there. But wait a minute, didn't you just say that all they had to do was say, you're here and you must have lied? Yes. The argument was that every single immigrant who came to Canada or the US after the Second World War as a displaced person was asked the same questions. So if you're here and we ask the questions, you obviously didn't tell the truth because we wouldn't have let you in. In Canada, I don't know if this is lucky or not, but the government destroyed all the archives 20 years ago. And so the defense was, you never asked me. And they said, yes, we did. And then your defense was, prove it. Show me the record. No record. In the United States, that didn't work quite as well because there were more records kept. But then that also presumes that every single immigration official was competent, careful, asked the appropriate question at the right time, and recorded it accurately. Look, I've been in the civil service of Canada, pretty good civil service, for many years. I've been on 2 boards, a parole board and an immigration and refugee board. I can tell you, every hearing was different, and the record keeping was different in every case, and even the understanding of what happened would be different depending on whether you're this side of the bar or that side of the bar. So, you know, in the post-war period with thousands of people trying to get to shelter, to asylum, it's just nonsense to believe that everyone was asked the same question and was asked and recorded carefully. And in fact, as we know from those 2 gentlemen I mentioned who both wrote books about their wartime experiences in the NKVD, SMERSH, and KGB, they admit, one of them admits, he lied. He lied. So why weren't they also subjected to naturalization and deportation? Who knows? But what's very interesting, you'll remember I mentioned that Deschênes was involved in investigating this in Canada. One of his informants was actually one of those Jewish Canadian men who'd served in the Judenrat and the Jewish ghetto police, in the NKVD, in the Communist Partisan movement, and then lied about what he was when he came to Canada. And he was an informant to the government, which never figured out that maybe he might have a bias. So, when you look back at all of this, and I'm sure Ron and a few of you who I know were involved in this kind of effort for over many years will remember this. When we think back on it, I see the so-called Nazi hunters as kind of like the modern day equivalent of the inquisitors of yesteryear. These were people who, you know, like at Salem, there are witches. Oh, your job is to go find the witches. Well, you better find witches, because if you don't find some witches, you're out of a job, right? So there are Nazis among us. That's kind of a sexy, I'd like to be a Nazi hunter. That sounds so cool, right? You know, searching for Adolf Hitler in Bolivia, searching for Heinrich Himmler in Bronx. I mean, whatever it may be, it's a kind of it's a catchy thing, right? I mean, it sounds like you're doing something so powerful, so just, so necessary. You know, if it were true, it'd be fine. They had to find witches. They had to find these heretics. They had to find this. So they kept stirring the story up, keep repeating the story. And of course, this caused great grief and harm to the Ukrainian American community and to ours. But it was easy work. How many people were actually brought to justice by the OSI? After years of effort, I think the number is around 151. And many of these people cut deals, left the country. It was never proven in a court of law that they'd actually done anything wrong. They just didn't want to fight the government. I mean, you against the government is a pretty powerful thing. As those men started to die off, and there are virtually none of them left, the proponents of the story that Nazis were among us switched gears, and it's become, in recent times, in the last decade or so, a memory war. That's what historians call it. People are now arguing that the displaced persons, their children and their children's children, put up monuments around North America celebrating fascists like Shukhevich, the head of the UPA, like members of the Ukrainian Divizia Halachina, the Galicia Division, SS Division, members of OUN, Bandera, Melnik, and so on. It doesn't matter which side of the politics you're on here. People are now saying, okay, all the Nazis are dead, maybe, or almost all of them are dead. Now what we have to do is make sure that those Ukrainians in that Edmonton Hall don't have a monument to Shukhevich. So we'll go spray paint it. We'll go destroy it. We'll go deface it. We will try to convince the wider American Canadian society that thousands of Nazis hid here after the war were never brought to justice because the judicial system just didn't work well enough, because, oh my God, we had to bother with something called evidence. You know, that's an inconvenience. We know the truth. And on top of that horror, their descendants, their children, people like me, built these monuments, these churches, these community centers where they celebrate these people and perpetuate these kind of neo-Nazi ideas. That has been the common theme of late. If you think about people like Simon Petlura, you know that his gravesite in France has been vandalized repeatedly over the years. Bandera's repeatedly over the years. Shukhevich's in Edmonton just last year. Let me tell you a funny side story about that one. There's a picture of Shukhevich in the book, the statue, and it says Nazi Memorial in red blood, kind of ink all over him, right? It's been cleaned up and it's restored. But what the culprit didn't know was that, on my advice, we'd installed 24-hour infrared security cameras. So we have a picture, we have a video of a man in a balaclava coming in there and spray painting this stuff on. Well, it doesn't do much good, it's dark, you can't tell who he is. Except a gentleman wearing exactly the same clothes minus the mask came back first thing in the morning with his camera to take pictures. Now, I don't know that it was him, maybe he was just a well-informed reporter, but he certainly broadcast it before the Ukrainian community of Edmonton even knew that there'd been vandalism. This guy was there. So sometimes our community is a little slow. I push them to describe this as a hate crime, and it's being investigated, and I understand that charges will be laid in the next week or so. And that will blow this wide open. Now, this man happens to be kind of a left-wing political activist who was the first to say, that's good that that horrible monument to that Ukrainian Nazi was defaced, because that shouldn't be in Canada, it shouldn't be here, it shouldn't be in a Ukrainian hall in Edmonton. You know, obviously some righteous citizen went and tried to destroy it, i.e. me. And now I'm bragging about it. He's, you know, what a fool. But you don't catch all of them. Right? You don't catch all of them. Sadly, and I have to say this, and I say this to you as American Ukrainians, I say this to Canadian Ukrainians as well. Our friends in the Jewish community, and we have more friends now in the Jewish community than I think we've ever had, because in part of the great work that President Zelensky has done. But they don't condemn these acts of vandalism. They don't condemn these hate crimes. It's as if this was okay, because their view is that these monuments do celebrate Nazis or neo-Nazis or collaborators. I had a debate or discussion, I suppose, with a leader of B'nai B'rith just the other day in Canada. And he told me that it was okay that a monument to the UPA and Divizia had been defaced in a cemetery in Oakville. In a cemetery. Who goes into a cemetery to deface stones? Hooligans. He said it was okay. And I said, well, aren't you aware of the fact that the Deschênes Commission investigated the wartime history of the Galicia Division and exonerated it as a unit, said it was not involved in war crimes? And he said, well, there was a secret Deschênes report. I go, well, then how do you know about it? It's a secret. I said, here's the public report. Here's what he says. You're telling me you're aware of some kind of secret report that had a different opinion? That made any sense. I said, here it is. And he looked at me and said, well, I have a different opinion. I go, that's fine. You can have all the opinions you want. You just happen to be wrong. I said, where were you during the Deschênes Commission when it was happening? And he looked kind of sheepish at that point. He said, I was in grade 12. Exactly. You know, so this is what's happening. Another generation of young, intelligent otherwise, Jewish Canadian kids and Jewish American kids are being raised to believe that Bandera was a fascist, Shukhevich was a fascist, the Ukrainians had an SS division, killed Jews, killed Poles. Remember, just a few years before all this really blew up this year, what were we hearing from our Polish American, Polish Canadian friends? Voling. That's all we heard was Voling for a couple of years. Now, you know, the Voling massacres, all killing Poles, and it was all a terrible atrocity, very one-sided. But the reality of it is, that's what we were hearing. Things have changed because of the 24th of February. There's no doubt about it. But the feeling that somehow Nazis came to North America, settled here, got away with it, perpetuated their ideals and their views in the next generations persists. And that is, frankly, a sad reality that is, I would say, telling evidence of the success of Operation Payback, this KGB plot to spread disinformation, fake news, and to strike anger into the Jewish and Ukrainian diaspora so that they would never unite. They skillfully manipulated Ukrainophobia. They constructed, orchestrated, nurtured, and thoroughly spread this lie. And even when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russian Federation continued it. And there's always been a gaggle of fellow travelers here in the West who have continued to echo the Soviet/Russian line. So when the Russians illegally occupied Crimea, when they began their war of aggression against Ukraine in 2014 in eastern Ukraine, when they escalated that war into the genocidal war against Ukraine and Ukrainians that's being fought today, which frankly in some ways is the Ukrainian War of Independence, the real one. But when they began all that, what words did they use to describe our friends, our fellow countrymen and countrywomen in Ukraine? Nazis, neo-Nazis, Banderites. If you look at any of the video footage of what's going on in Ukraine today, there are many Russian soldiers who talk about they're there to get rid of the Banderites. They're there to get rid of the UPA. They're there to get rid of the Ukrainian nationalists. And they conflate that with Nazi. Nationalist, Nazi, it's all the same. Right? Now, again, as I started, the prejudices of Mr. Putin are at least consistent with the views of a person who was socialized, raised in the Soviet world. He is a Soviet man. And so he continues to be an advocate of the ahistorical claim that Ukrainians and Russians are one blood, one people. And he continues to spread and to re-spread slanders against a nation that's fighting a defensive war against Russian imperialism. And part of his campaign is this hybrid warfare, this disinformation contained in Operation Payback. So how do I now, after having shared all these ideas with you, how do I look at it? What's going to happen? Well, among you, I'm sure there are some more sublime souls than mine. There are probably some of you as Christians who are going to say, forgive them for they know not what they do. But I've come to the understanding that those who concocted this miasma, those who continue to peddle these lies, those who continue to promote the propaganda of Operation Payback, they know and they knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it quite deliberately, and they are still doing it. So I have to stand here in front of you and acknowledge the real genius of the architects of Operation Payback. Give the devil his due. You've all heard that. Give the devil his due. They not only mined pre-existing ethnic stereotypes and prejudices on both sides, but they re-engineered those into a much more virulent strain. And then they broadcast those tropes comprehensively, spreading, if you like, a pandemic of venomous half-truths and prejudices that continues to infect our fellow Americans, our fellow Canadians. That's a pretty heavy illness, and it was very laboriously manufactured. And so, sadly, I will say to you that I do not believe there's any cure, save for the passage of time. I certainly pray the truth will someday set our peoples, both of them, free, but I have no hope of this happening in my lifetime, whatever time I have left on Earth, nor indeed do I believe it will happen before several more generations have come and wandered and gone. You see, the poison of Operation Payback was planted far too perfectly and far too well. Thank you very much for your attention.